By late 1944, the sky over Germany was no longer a battlefield, it was a slaughterhouse. The Luftwaffe was being systematically erased by thousands of Allied bombers and their Mustang escorts, and the Nazi leadership was spiraling into a state of total panic. In a final, desperate attempt to regain control, they launched the Emergency Fighter Program, a plan so radical it bordered on insanity. They needed a weapon that was faster than any Allied plane, but could be built without the strategic metals they no longer possessed. The result was the Heinkel HE-162, often called the Volksjäger or the People's Fighter, but history remembers it as the glue jet. This was a machine that represented the ultimate glitch in military engineering, a high-performance turbojet fighter constructed almost entirely of wood and an experimental adhesive that was literally eating the plane alive. The timeline for its development was a suicide pact. The engineers were given exactly 90 days to go from a blank sheet of paper to a flying prototype. Because aluminum was prioritized for other projects, the wings, tail, and nose of the HE-162 were made of plywood and spruce, held together by a synthetic glue called Tego film. However, the glitch that would haunt this aircraft began when the primary factory producing that stable glue was vaporized in a British bombing raid. Desperate to keep the assembly lines moving in hidden underground salt mines, the Germans switched to a substitute acidic adhesive. They didn't realize until it was too late that this new glue had a catastrophic chemical flaw. It was corrosive. It would slowly soak into the wood fibers, weakening the structural bonds from the inside out. During the very first public demonstration of the prototype, as the pilot reached high speeds to impress the Nazi high command, the acidic glue failed. The leading edge of the wing peeled away like wet paper, and the aircraft disintegrated in mid-air, killing the test pilot. Despite this, the Reich ordered mass production to continue, fueled by the delusion that they could out-engineer their own collapse. The design itself was a masterpiece of terrifying innovation, featuring a BMW turbojet engine mounted directly on top of the fuselage, right behind the pilot's head. This layout was so dangerous that it required the world's first operational ejection seat, because if a pilot tried to jump out normally, they would be instantly sucked into the jet intake and shredded. But the most horrific part of the HE-162 story wasn't just its dissolving wings, it was who was intended to fly it. The Nazis planned to take children from the Hitler Youth, give them basic training in wooden gliders, and then throw them into the cockpit of a 560-mile-per-hour jet that was aerodynamically unstable and structurally melting. It was a high-tech suicide weapon that ignored the laws of chemistry and common sense, a wooden ghost in the sky that proved that when a regime is at its end, its final miracle is often just a beautifully engineered coffin.
As the Third Reich crumbled, the glue jet transitioned from a desperate engineering project to a terrifying reality for the teenagers forced into its cockpit. The Nazi leadership didn't just want a new plane, they wanted a miracle that required zero professional experience to operate. Their plan was a logistical and moral glitch in the history of warfare. They would take children from the Hitler Youth, give them a few weeks of training in basic wooden gliders, and then strap them into a high-performance jet that moved at nearly 600 miles per hour. This wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence. The HE-162 was perhaps the most twitchy aircraft ever built. Because the engine was mounted on top of the fuselage, the plane had a high center of gravity that made it incredibly unstable. If a novice pilot moved the control stick just a fraction of an inch too far, the plane would enter a violent, uncontrollable roll. It was a machine that demanded the skills of an elite ace, yet it was being handed to 16-year-olds who had never felt the kick of a turbojet engine. The death trap characteristics. The ejection seat gamble. The HE-162 featured the world's first operational ejection seat, but it was a terrifying glitch of its own. Because the engine intake was directly behind the pilot, if the ejection canopy failed to clear the seat properly, the pilot would be fired directly into the spinning blades of the BMW turbojet. The flame-out factor. The BMW 003 was notorious for flaming out if the pilot adjusted the throttle too quickly. In the heat of a dogfight, a split-second decision to accelerate could turn the glue jet into a 5,000-pound wooden glider with no way to restart the engine. The melting wings. Pilots were strictly forbidden from performing high-G maneuvers. The acidic glue was so unreliable that any sharp turn at high speed risked the wings literally delaminating. The plywood skin would peel off mid-flight, causing the plane to disintegrate instantly. First contact, the ghost in the clouds. In April 1945, the elite unit Jagdgeschwader 1 finally took the HE-162 into combat. When Allied pilots first saw the tiny shark-shaped jet screaming through the air, they thought they were hallucinating. During one of the first recorded encounters, a British Hawker Tempest, one of the fastest piston-engine fighters in the world, spotted an HE-162. The British pilot dove to intercept, but the glue jet simply throttled up and disappeared into the distance like a ghost. The Allies realized with horror that this cheap wooden plane was faster than their most advanced fighters. But while it could outrun the enemy, it couldn't outrun its own mechanical failures. Most HE-162 losses weren't caused by Allied bullets, but by the plane itself. In one tragic week, JG-1 lost more pilots to structural failure and engine fires than to actual combat. The glitch was absolute. The Nazis had built a plane that was too fast for its own materials and too complex for its own pilots. The combat glitch. Even with its flaws, the HE-162 scored at least one confirmed kill. A British pilot was shot down by a mysterious jet that seemed to appear out of nowhere, fired a devastating burst from its 20mm cannons, and vanished before the wingman could even turn his head. It was proof that if the glue had held and the pilots had been trained, the HE-162 could have turned the air war into a nightmare for the Allies. But by then, the glue jet was a weapon without a country, flying from hidden forest strips while the Soviet and American armies closed in from both sides.
As the Soviet and Western armies squeezed the remaining life out of the Third Reich in May 1945, they stumbled upon a site that looked like science fiction abandoned in the mud. In forest clearings and hidden underground salt mines, Allied soldiers discovered dozens of tiny shark-like Heinkel 162s, some still smelling of fresh paint and wood sap. The glitch was finally laid bare for the world to see. The most advanced jet technology of the era sitting on tricycle landing gear with a fuselage made of forest timber. The British, in particular, were desperate to know if this wooden toy was actually the threat they feared, so they handed the keys to one of the greatest test pilots in history, Captain Eric Winkle Brown. When Brown climbed into the cockpit of the captured jet, he realized immediately that the Germans had created a mechanical paradox. The plane was incredibly light and possessed a visibility from the cockpit that was better than almost any Allied fighter. But as soon as he fired up the BMW turbojet, he felt the true predatory nature of the machine. It was a pilot's plane in the most dangerous sense of the word. Brown later described it as having the most sensitive controls he had ever experienced. It was so aerodynamically on the edge that it felt like balancing a needle on the tip of a finger. During the secret post-war evaluation, the glitch of the acidic glue was confirmed in a way that horrified Western engineers.
Analysis of captured airframes revealed that the substitute adhesive used in the final months of the war was so unstable that it didn't just fail under stress, it effectively turned the wings into a chemical time bomb. If the plane was kept in a humid environment or left out in the rain, the glue would absorb moisture and begin to liquefy, meaning a plane that looked perfectly fine on the ground could literally dissolve into sawdust and splinters the moment it hit 500 miles per hour. Despite this, Brown was shocked to find that the Heinkel 162 was actually more stable in a high-speed dive than the legendary Me 262, proving that the basic aerodynamic design was a masterpiece, even if the materials were a total disaster. The glue jet became a grim lesson for the Cold War era in the limits of emergency engineering. It was the first aircraft to prove that a nation could mass-produce high-tech weaponry using low-skilled labor and non-strategic materials, a concept that would eventually influence the development of modern disposable cruise missiles and cheap, attritable drones. But for the pilots of 1945, the Heinkel 162 remained a symbol of a regime that had run out of both time and morality. The legacy of the Volksjäger is one of extreme desperation, a machine that tried to bridge the gap between a medieval construction of wood and a futuristic world of jet propulsion. Today, the few surviving Heinkel 162s sit in museums like the Smithsonian and the Imperial War Museum as silent witnesses to a moment in history when a superpower tried to cheat physics with plywood and acid. It was a weapon that was too fast for its era, too dangerous for its own pilots, and ultimately too broken to save a dying empire. It stands as the ultimate example of suicide engineering, a mechanical glitch that vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the haunting image of a wooden ghost that was designed to win a war but ended up as a beautifully engineered coffin.